Hey, Susan.
Hello, Eric. How are you today?
Oh, I'm not bad. How you doing?
Good. Just had lunch.
Good, good. Did you solve your configuration woes?
Um, no, it's still giving the same error, but like I can work around it if I comment out the service account creation logic. But I was also running into some other issue with the secret store driver because I was trying to test out the rotation feature.
Uh-huh.
And then I have like a bunch of dangling resources. Like if I have time, I will um, maybe show that to you later this meeting.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be interesting. Because I'm thinking from like I'm trying to remember what it actually does from a volume mount perspective, because I think I don't remember.
Sure, let me share screen. The right here.
Oh, I need a haircut. I'm looking progressively more homeless as the days go by.
Nah, not
Have I can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, no, I just noticed Zoom doesn't have the little highlighter that
Oh yeah,
team.
that shows you.
Yeah, so it's always confusing. Uh, cool. I have populated the agenda with 3 items. Before we start, are there other like higher priority things that people want to put on the agenda?
I I don't know how high a priority, but I was going to talk about for the issue that I was looking at, which is our default config has a stubbed value. So um, I had a proposal about that.
Yeah, feel free to go first. I think the CRD discussion will take a bit longer.
Okay, so this essentially stems from issue number 79, which is that our default config has a cert path or cert folder. It has some value um, that is just meant to be a placeholder. Yeah, cert folder. So it does have that, which means that if you were to build Ratify and just attempt to install it and run it via CLI, or you were attempt to just Docker run our container, our Docker container, it would crash because of this. And part of that is because you have to provide it something for it to go look in a folder currently. We check to see if the cert paths value in the config is empty. If it has a length of 0, we bail out. And if it has some path that's not valid, it also bails out. So one thing that I put there is we could, when we do an install, we put it in the user's home directory along with the configuration. And so we could change the default config JSON to look for a folder that's under that directory, and it would run. But then we would be shipping a Ratify that by default has notary turned on with no certificates as the root CA. So if you attempted to validate anything, I think it would fail. And so my kind of thought was, well, I feel like we should not ship by default with any verifiers like I don't know if misconfigured is the right word, but like
uninitialized.
Yeah. Essentially, like shipping or like running it that way, in my opinion, like without somebody, the user, like configuring something is like undefined behavior, because I don't know, like what should the expectation be? I mean, I follow, like I agree that for our Docker container, the default behavior of crashing currently is not good. But like maybe we ship without any of the verifiers turned on. So nothing happens unless you explicitly configure stuff. So that was my pitch. And then
So which verifiers today are turned on by default?
node. So if you go to our config.json, I believe it's just notary, but yeah, that everything that's in our config.json, like if you were to build Ratify from source and you call make install, this is what you'll get. So you'll get pass-through mode because it's there, and then you will get an example SBOM, and you'll get an example license. You'll get license checker, and you'll get a misconfigured notary v2. And I pinged this in our chat, but this sort of stems from we don't have like a markdown file that we are documenting all of the options as far as plugins go, and for each of those plugins, all of the options as far as the configuration of those plugins. And so the like default mode of operation is when you make something, put it into the sample config. So I don't like this. Is like for me is a sample config, but we are also then turning around and using it quite a bit. So so my vote would probably be to change this to ship with very nothing, and then to add documentation that covers this stuff, and then leave it to the user to properly configure this if they're going to run it in, CI, or like from the CLI, or from just the bare Docker container. Like for our Helm chart, we ship with notary turned on, and we actually create, I put a link in the comment from the issue, but we do some air quote sane defaults when you ship via the chart so that it does something. But again, the thought would probably be that the user would need to do some amount of configuration if they were going to do anything more than notary. So I guess thoughts on that.
Can we have different charts?
We can, yeah. So we can have
sample chart and the barebone chart with on which you can add.
Well, I would just say to keep the one chart, but basically make the default one. So I agree, like having a config that's kind of empty, so Docker doesn't crash, and so people don't find weird bugs when something's set weird or off, is good. But at the same time, I think with what Sajid is saying, and just in general, is we want to keep for the demo, like kind of workflow of showing notation working, right? We want to have that still on. And so if there's a value in a Helm chart we could do to set to basically enable the notation stuff and how it is today, that might satisfy both things.
Yeah. So today we're shipping with the Microsoft public cert. Notary is shipped turned on by default, and if you don't do anything else when you install Ratify, you're shipping with the Microsoft public cert. So the chart is fine, but the other, like the CLI use cases and just the bare, like I don't know why you would ever run just the bare Docker container.
Right.
So I personally, yeah, it shouldn't crash because that's not a good user experience, but also that should never be a valid use case. So
right.
Yeah.
No, I hear you.
So,
I mean, because the other option, like you said, is just to possibly just fix the path to where it works locally, and then that gets overridden on normal deploy. But that's kind of more of a just fix this particular issue.
Yeah, and because our config that we have in the repo, like that is essentially ignored because when we run Ratify in via the chart, we have all sorts of chart artifacts that that make it so that the config that is in the repo is not anything like what you'll run. And the config is kind of cobbled together via Helm like variables. So if you set, you know, in the values.yaml for the chart, if you set this, we add a little bit more to the config. And if you set this, then we swap values around. So the config that is in the chart is a little more accessible because we've plumbed those values out for people to play with it. So this would be my push would be specifically for just making the CLI and the container just essentially a no op if you run them without your own config.
Yeah, I'd be for that. And then, I mean, I just posted a link, but I see you're doing that with cosine enabled or not. I mean, you could do the same. You could do the same thing in the chart. We could do the same thing in the chart with, you know, with the other plugins, right? Including Notary. I see there. That's where Notary is right installed by default.
Yeah.
So you could just do if whatever values dot whatever Notary v2 dot enabled. And by default, when people deploy the chart, that's maybe set to yes. But I don't know.
Yeah. So we could, I mean, I'm a little like, since our canonical case for the like Kubernetes deployment is signature validation, I was leaning towards for now not touching the way that the chart works. I was just going to change the default config. So like for verification certs, that's in the this path right here that's on screen. I was just going to change cert folder to some path and see if what problems that causes.
Sounds good.
So, but yeah, I just wanted to call that out that we probably also, I don't know, we might have an issue for it. I'd have to look, but instead of having like this sample config to rule them all, if we just make a markdown that talks about all of these, and then just whittle this to nothing.
Yeah, no, I think I would. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think that a markdown doc that describes all the config options, we should put an issue up on that because I think that would be useful, independent of this issue you're fixing. But yeah, I think unless there's somebody thinks otherwise, I do think we should kind of have the null like default thing as long as we have it working in the demo flow still.
Cool. Okay.
Eric, you said you'll put it into a default cert path. What is the default cert path you're thinking about?
So when we call for that, there's also differences there. So when we call make install, like if you were going to run this on your local machine, we put it in your home directory under home.ratify. So I was thinking, I could just make it that, but then from Docker, we run from a different location. So we could potentially see if we could make that directory that it expects just so that it wouldn't crash in the Docker container with like directory not found. So that was my approach. I was going to see if I could make a directory that would just be empty, that it would check, and then add that well-known path here.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, that seems like extra work. I'd almost rather have a use case of if somebody runs Ratify with no configuration, that there's a generic catch-all that says you have no Ratify configuration, no verifier, right? And then that handles kind of everything, because it's like, what if, something else even with Notary v2 comes up and then that's off, and then trying to hack paths, there's a lot of other use cases versus just the generic, there's no verifier and Ratify's running.
Yeah, so I'll have to look, because if you can specify tag C to give a config path, and if you don't do that, Ratify will also check that well-known path under home.ratify for the config. And I believe if it doesn't find it there, it will error. It throws an error. So we could do that. It's just, do we want to consider if we just changed not finding a config from an error to like a, oh, you just ran this on purpose with no config, then the container wouldn't technically crash, but you might have other issues if they do specify a path to a config and it's just not in the right place, and the container, instead of throwing an error and crash looping, is completing.
Yeah, no,
so-
it would be useful. I mean, yeah, it would be useful because that is, I guess you're right. That is a customer could put in an invalid path in a regular config, and then there's either no certs or it just doesn't exist. And instead of crashing, it would be a better experience to have them have an error message back saying the path, Ratify is trying to use this path for certs and it doesn't exist, so blah, right?
Yeah. So I guess I'm just saying if in any case we out, because even today I think we give that, like, we do give an error message that something didn't work as expected. It's just like, oh, how do we want to handle, like in some cases, if we're trying to catch all, we'll just have to think about how that works, I suppose. Because we wouldn't want to take something that is a potential, like that could be a potential error, and treat it as like a no-op, since that could potentially complicate the Kubernetes deployment.
Okay, well, I don't know if you want to just write this up to kind of summarize either in the issue or in notes,
I can.
And then we can just kind of go from there, because there's a number of good ideas. I think they're here, and we obviously have something we need to do. One of them to at least fix this particular bug. But then there's the bigger picture, right? So, yeah.
All right.
Okay.
What's next? What do we want to do?
Yeah, next on the agenda, I wanted to just go through the notary certificates as CRD design documentation a bit more. We talked about it yesterday, but we can go through it in a bit more detail. Yeah, I think this is the right doc. So I tried to capture all the user scenarios that we have. So the first one is when Ratify is being running locally as like a one-off validation. And I think there is no update of certificates needed there, because it's every time we load it and we validate and the process ends. Is that correct? Just want to confirm my understanding.
Sounds good.
Yep.
And in a non-Kubernetes runtime environment, I'm not sure like what that looks like. Like, how would the customer update the certificates? Does Ratify just lives like a server kind of thing? Like, how do we think?
I wanted to prioritize this first. Can we put the K8s cluster experience first, CLI experience second, and third is nothing else, or like not?
Okay.
Not in scope. Okay.
Yeah, sure, that's cool.
Okay. Not scope. Okay. So the Kubernetes cluster experience today, I think Eric went, like you were just talking about how the secret stuff work. And one of my question is, I'm not sure if we included the secret mechanism just for demo purpose, or is this actually a, maybe like, is it 50% of the customers would actually specify their validation certificate through this mechanism?
No, I kind of answered, actually, I think that was one of your questions below. I answered that. I do not see this at all as anything other than a demo use case, because inherently Kubernetes secrets by themselves are insecure. So this is, but no one should ever be using this in a production scenario, in my opinion.
But these are public certs, right?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't necessarily matter if they leaked. So
Yeah, I get your point. I don't.
This is equivalent of trusting cert bundles, the CS cert bundles in some way, right?
yeah, so there's, I guess,
Yeah.
the one that you have laid out there, Susan, is the secret store CSI driver. Is that right?
Oh, sorry. What's the question? I was trying to read the David.
For I could see secret store driver being a valid use case. I mean, it's volume mounting, so it doesn't use secrets, like Kubernetes secrets, and it does handle a lot of the rotation, like the lift for rotation and stuff like that. It wouldn't necessarily use Ratify's principle to gain access to the key vault, but I mean, is there a reason, David, that you wouldn't think this would be an approach somebody could take, like a reasonable approach? Or is this just not what you would want users to do, like as a best practice?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think your point of, if you think of a customer, like, I guess in my head anyway, I consider Kubernetes secrets, just assume that they're not secret, right? Mm-hmm. And if I have that in mind, you're right. Okay. Does the question then comes back to, does it matter, or does an enterprise care if, let's say, anybody can know the certificates that they're trusting? And I don't know for sure the answer to that. But I mean, so yeah, I guess in some sense, that's my dilemma, I guess. And I just don't know of anybody who, I mean, it's almost like, in some sense, like, if we really don't care, then putting the certificates into a config file or something, right? It's like, what's the difference? I mean, maybe I'm overly harsh on the Kubernetes secrets thing, but it is. I know there are ways to encrypt the secret store and things like that, but it's, I don't know. I mean, I guess if I had two options and I was trying to run this in production, I just don't see why I would go that route ever, right? I mean,
yeah.
Well, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, it, like, for instance, we have a workload identity option, we have a KMS, like, that just seems like that's where you would do things,
Yeah, well, so I guess that from an implementation perspective, the delta here is we're leaning very heavily on the secret store driver to do all the key vault interaction, and we don't yet have a Ratify based plugin architecture that supports dynamically getting secrets and putting them in the in-memory search bundle. So yeah, if that existed, that'd be nice, but it doesn't exist yet.
That's exactly the thing that we should write. I think I support that. Let's build that.
Right, and that's what I called out, like, down below in some of the questions. I don't know if we're jumping ahead of game here, but so I in the, like, one of the items I had there is, like, number one, you said, wondering if CSI has the ability to read all certs from a secret provider. And I mean, like, one of the ideas is, like, well, if you wrapped, let's say, our own CRD or whatever around the secrets driver thing, I mean, you could kind of hack the gap today, to pull in. And I mean, there's obviously a lot of ways you could do it, but I think, like, you're right. Like, if we just use CSI driver today, as you called out, Susan, it's like a manual, like, every single one the customer has to list, and you have to type all the names, right? And that just, to me, is a bad experience. But as larger the number of certificates you trust grow, the worse of the experience that kind of becomes, right? So having, let's say, a directory in KMS that is the the certs that we trust to sign stuff, and that dynamically pulling down is like to me the scenario that would be a great customer experience.
So
Yeah,
When you
that is
s- when you say
point.
I- sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just a quick note about like, do we usually when we say we trust things, shouldn't it be the smaller number of things that we trust, the better, the more secure? So I was wondering if
Well-
CSI Store decided not to do the read all because they want customer to specifically say, I only trust this version and these set of
Right.
secrets.
Right. So if I project, no, you're right in general. You you want to start with a no trust option, right? You don't want to trust anybody by default, and that's what notation is operating on. That being said, as the world around us evolves and continues to add more and more things that are signed, there's going to be scenarios where, let's say, even within an enterprise, you may have multiple certificates that are saying, hey, I trust this team and that team and not others. And also external parties, right? Like Microsoft would have, let's say, a public cert, and you'd want to trust some from them. So it over time, I see this growing and growing. We're not at the, I don't think we have any customer saying, I want 100 certs right now in my trust store. But I think over time, it's gonna go down that trajectory. Right. So where you want to have a mechanism in place where it's reasonable for somebody that has, a larger number of certificates to not have to paste them in one by one.
Is it fair to start with one or two? I'm just saying two because it's always better to have an array for wherever we want to think about this. But start with a small. Okay, you got to use the cert. You specify the cert, and then worry about the enumeration and the large set of certs, because I think the end-to-end would still be the same. It would be experience on how you specify these things that would change. The other thing is the notation policy is the one that needs to know what these certs are and where these certs are. So my concern is the notation policy hasn't been written yet, right? The policy implementation is still kind of up in the air.
Yep.
So can we just have the CSI driver talk to Ratify as a V1, and then once it starts talking, what all needs to be sent or how many certs need to be sent can be secondary config or even like pushed in somehow, or that experience improved over time? Because I think the identity is most important here, right? Not is that fair, or do we have a larger concern?
Well, we already have today. I mean, it works today, right? Where you can put in one cert and then you're good, right? I mean, that's
An array of certs.
Yeah, you could put an array of certs in, right? I mean, you could put in, right? You could put in just the file names that are in Azure Key Vault, and that's going to work, right? Does
Ratify already talk with the CSI driver pod, or no?
No, so I have
Well,
a note here that says, so it's like you can replace the secrets in this array, and you can do a like Kubernetes replace command, and CSI driver would probably, I haven't validated, but it'll probably update the path, the actual files, the mount path wouldn't change. And the documentation calls out the application who's consuming the content on disk will need to watch for the file change.
Okay. So the file watcher was the right implementation either way.
Yes, I was planning on adding the file watcher on the certificate path. Okay. I have an item to track that.
Yeah. So
I agree though. I think because we talked about this before, that if just in terms of certificates, like, especially considering the CSI secret store driver is like kind of pretty well established and a cross cloud thing, and it's starting to bake in other rotation and other things. I do think it's good to probably take that as a dependency versus writing our own thing that's custom, like to pull from Key Vault or whatever, right? So that totally, I think that totally makes sense. The question though is that I still have is number 3 that I put down here, and the idea of having the actual verifier itself config, including certificates, being an option, right? Versus because we already, like you said, we already have a CRD today for just like we could specify the certificate in the CSI driver, and that in and of itself is a CRD, and that can work, right, with our setup that we have. But this approach is something I wanted to try and consider, and I only threw down some quick advantages, disadvantages, but that kind of changes the matrix a little in terms of how we think, right?
Is the question whether we should write a notation or a notary verifier CRD?
No, I would call it a ratify verifier CRD, right? And so then that way, like, yeah, so then you would have a verifier CRD, one CRD, right? Not like a whole ton of CRDs, because that's just craziness, right? But then the verifier CRD, you'd have, of course, a specific one, a CRD that implements notation v2, and that would be, if you're doing that and you're going down that path, in my mind, it also would make sense potentially, right, to map the certificates in with that, right? Because when you run that instance of the notation v2 verifier, that's going to have some set of certs with it.
Right, and the identity that this CRD would need, would it have to configure the CSI driver? Is that where you're going with this?
Yeah, and so you would still use the CSI under the hood, and you'd wrap that in, right? And that's where you could do something like I mentioned in number one, where you could automate some stuff around the limitation in the CSI store driver CRD thing to handle that scenario. Let's say somebody specifies a directory, right, and then just give me all the certs there to then populate the trust store, right, of all the certificates.
Okay, the reason why I like it is because this is one less paper cut for them to incorrectly configure the CSI driver with a credential and things like that. I think, is that where you're kind of like trying to avoid the customer kind of tripping over, oh, we configured CSI, now we configured Ratify, and we configured policy. So it's like one CRD that just takes care of the set underneath.
Right. And so that's one of the things I mentioned there, cleaner abstraction from a customer perspective, the third bullet there.
Okay.
Right, you just have like one place, notation v2 verifier. I just specify that. I don't have to worry about like, all the rest. Just tell me, like for instance, I want that, and I want, here's my key vault location where all my certificates are.
Okay.
That's it.
I did like having the multi-level from a multi-tenancy perspective, like from the same way that Gatekeeper operates, where they have a constraint template that you can define and everybody can use it, but then you can define many constraints that may apply to different namespaces, may have different parameters for the template. That's sort of where I was thinking, if you have a notary verifier, but you might have like certs, like if you had one CRD for notary verifier that had to have all the certs, do we want to consider the case right now where X or N number of teams working in the same cluster have to manage, their own team's certificates, and then they have to smash them all together in this one CRD? Or if we don't want to address that, then we can ignore that for now. But pardon me for my lack of knowledge here. Can CRDs be scoped to namespaces or no? I think so. I'd have to check. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Is that good enough to partition?
I was thinking more. Well, actually, I'm not sure. I'd have to check.
So I haven't tried this out today. I mean, I'm just curious. Like if I ran running Ratify in multiple namespaces, would Ratify be scoped to just that namespace for each verifier?
No, because what you would end up doing is the Ratify only gets called because of the Rego and because of the CRD that we file with Gatekeeper to say that we're an external data provider. So all calls through Gatekeeper are going to go to the requisite external data provider, assuming that the Rego suggests that. So, technically it could not work that way if via the Rego you said that, oh, like you might be able to write Rego that says, oh, if the namespace equals blah, make a call to external data provider, ABC. But that would be completely within the Rego. So whatever the Rego says to do, Gatekeeper will do. And if that says to call our external data provider, then it will call it. And I don't think you can have them overlap. So you could run more than one Ratify, but you'd have to register them as separate external data providers, and then they would only get called if they were explicitly called via the Rego.
So then, that could be a potential additional thing that a CRD could do.
So we could potentially run more than one Ratify, I guess. We'd have to might get
or one Ratify. So or one Ratify with multiple configs. I don't know. I don't know. I'm just trying to right, because that's the thing that I'm trying to play out here, right? Is like the scale and the multi-tenant. I mean, it starts to bleed into this. So it's worth just thinking as an advantage or disadvantage, right? But I think it's a total like reasonable use case for a customer, for instance, to say for this namespace, I want to verify only or trust these things. Maybe for the other one, I want a different one. I mean, and I also could see this for different, n number of verifiers, right? Like maybe this namespace doesn't want the SBOM one, but it does want the, the notary one, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
So we had talked about that a little bit with Lee because they had expressed interest in that, in having namespace scoped Ratify configs. And my thought was the best approach would be for Ratify to maintain a library of configurations based on, star or based on namespace. And then we would have to include, since Gatekeeper knows more information than Ratify does, we would have to plumb that through from Gatekeeper, and then we could support that. But the current interface between Ratify and Gatekeeper was only designed really to give us the like images, like an array of images or containers that we need to validate. And so we had talked to them and said, oh, well, we could, they're like, you could design whatever protocol you want to pass information so long as it's an array of strings. So yeah, we could do that. And there were ways to work within the existing boundaries and get that done. But yeah, it'd be kind of a hack.
We can put in the namespace there.
Yeah. So when I was talking to Sertaj, he was like, oh yeah, why don't you put image namespace, image namespace.
I was thinking namespace image, but okay, whichever.
Yeah. Or, so essentially we know in Ratify that all of our external data calls are going to be providing data in that format.
All right.
But then, and the Rego authors would just have to know that it has to happen that way. Which, I mean, they have to know the contract anyways, because if they're calling external data, so maybe not a huge burden, but yes, that was my thought is we should have one Ratify, and, when it comes time to consider multi-tenancy and people in different namespaces wanting different configurations, then we would, support that through Ratify, and we could make that configurable via the CRDs as long as the way that we implemented initially could be extended that way.
So David, quick question. What do you want tackled next? The reason I'm asking is I want to hopefully prioritize something for the next couple of months, and then call out like your next target RC or whichever the releases will kind of knock down these 3 or 4 things that we need to do. So do we want to prioritize that list, or do you have a list already?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we have. We went through in the past, I think you just weren't here in the past weeks, but we have that in the data milestone that's up on the list up there. And I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but yeah.
No, I'm hoping that you and Luis can work with the engineering team to make sure that there's a priority item on people so that they know exactly what they're working on. That's kind of what I'm hoping.
Yeah, and that's what we have in the projects list right now. And I also set up a weekly dev stand-up sync on Tuesdays, so we're making sure that everybody's got priorities for what they're working on. So yeah, there you go. But yeah, I mean, happy to have. I mean, there's obviously other factors here that are don't make sense to discuss on the community call. So I think it'd probably be better we talk more in another context.
Sounds good.
Yep. So yeah, so I guess I'd like to try and hopefully round out. I know we've thrown a whole bunch out here, Susan, on your design. I think this is awesome that you put this together. It helps kind of drive the discussion, obviously, but I think in general, it sounds like we're all, I think, in agreement that using the CSI driver is a good thing, right?
Yes.
Okay. So then the next question is, do we move forward with CRDs? And if we move forward with CRDs, are we gonna try and do just a certificate one, or more of the verifier approach that includes certificates, like what I mentioned in number 3, or something else?
Yeah, I had a sync with Bin because I know he was previously working or starting on the CRD for verifiers in the store. So like, of course, the verifier plus certificate is a new piece, but he said he have the CRD spec defined and have generated code on that. Like, he was giving some guidance on like which CRD generators to use to generate the client and the informers, I think he was calling them. So sounds like he already gotten started. And I feel like because we know the file watcher on the certificate path, it will be missing. And if we continue to use the CSI driver, like, we'll need that piece for Ratify to detect the certificate change. So I was thinking that I can start working on that next. What do you think, David?
Before we go down that path, how many CSI mount points or setups would we have to do if we have multiple namespaces in them? Like, can the CSI driver span across? Because the identity used for a CSI driver might be to certain set of key walls. And so if you have 2 sets of key walls that are in 2 different namespaces, the verifier would have to, or the CRD would have to kind of set them up, and maybe it's multiple key walls. It kind of like will affect the design of Ratify being able to talk to CSI as well, right? Like those mount points and whatnot, because they would be at different file paths and whatnot. So enabling support for multiple namespaces is way more complex in my head right now. And I'm thinking we need to do that, but how do we tackle this going forward? At least put in the design in the right place where we support one, but we'll have to make the change to support multiples following up. Do we know already in terms of CSI and the identity model?
I don't know about their identity model. I think I've read somewhere that they support multiple providers. Like, you can have different providers in the same cluster, but I don't know if you can specify this resource is used for this namespace.
Right, because you have a key vault name and then that's one provider. How do you specify multiple key vaults in this? I don't know. Anyway, again, this is something we can talk about.
Provider class, right? Is that you can have multiple objects for the same kind of CRD?
I don't know.
No, you can. Eric is nodding his head.
He's saying yes.
Yeah. Yes.
He's not really
for the same kind, yes, you can make multiple objects. Yeah. So the name is what would delineate them, because that's what you here. You're saying the name of this this set of secrets is blah, and then above or wherever you reference this in your actual like deployment manifest, you reference it by that name. So you could make a bunch of these with different names that have different secrets, and you just reference them by name.
If we want to track which namespace this is for, could we add like annotations to it, or?
You could add annotations. This may get into RBAC. I'd have to I have to look.
Well, there
into-
should be, I mean, there should be a way to query by default, just the core Kubernetes, which namespace thing exists in.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you by default it searches in default if you don't do attack and pass something. So
But you could, but you could also like query the object on which namespace it resides in, right? So, or that's in that. This isn't all of the metadata that Kubernetes has. This is just the YAML for deploying it. So if you try and query the actual thing on the cluster, you'll be able to determine programmatically the namespace.
Yeah, if you describe it, you'll get all kinds of stuff.
I see. And for the identity model, like if we're saying one identity can access one set of key values, so if somehow the customer makes sure that this client ID specified here only have access to the key values specified in this file, are we good, Sajay?
Yeah, I think so. But this is something that we would handle if we have a CRD over it, right? Like they would specify, this is the vault name, this is my ID. You generate this on the fly and somehow get CSI to mount it. And then you get a mount point or some location, which you then need to tell Ratify that this is the mount point and whatnot. So that whole thing needs to be taken care of by us, is what my understanding is. Correct me if I've misunderstood here.
So that would be, we would be, from a CRD perspective, we'd be more of an operator at that point.
Right.
If you wanted to dynamically create, because you can, like, once something is mounted, if it's like a flex volume type thing where you could change the stuff within it, then it doesn't actually upset the pod. But as soon as you want to add mounts, I'm pretty sure you have to roll the pod. So we could write a CRD so there's like 3 levels of this. One level is you use CSI driver. One level is you have this operator pattern, and the operator is going to take everything that you put into it, and it's going to cobble together a Ratify deployment that has all the appropriate stuff, and then it's going to make it go. And if you change that, then the operator might roll the pod, but the new way it is how you like it. And then the third way is we have CRDs that the Ratify process gets interacted with directly, and then you might be changing things on the fly, like in memory and process. So those are like the 3 like levels of like configurability your integration.
Today we're at level 1. We use CRD.
Yeah, we're at 1.
Right.
So
the operator, and I wouldn't necessarily say level 2 and 3 are like, you wouldn't go in order. You wouldn't do an operator and do that. You pick one of the 2 paths to pick, right? And so yeah, so I'm more, I mean, operators to me just, I kind of, I don't know, have a little bit of a hinge on them. But it is, you're right, it is a valid possibility. And I think if we were if we were in a purist, like all I care about is operating the CSI secret driver, then I think it might make a little more sense. But my gut still feels like the right thing is the third approach, especially if we're doing a verifier that contains certificates, is the thing. I mean, that's basically roughly what Lee proposed. And the more I think about it, it just tends to make sense, because there's different scenarios for each verifier that you probably want to do like different custom things. Let's just ignore the CSI volume mount stuff, right? Each verifier is going to have slightly different things that there's going to be more than likely different use cases where if we had the CRD model for the verifier, that then you're going to enable that verifier to do things to make the experience better, right?
Right. Yes. So that, yeah, I mean, that's the best, that's the best approach. Like, you have the most control over how stuff works in that approach. You just get to borrow the least stuff. So, but yeah, I agree. I think that's the approach.
Okay. I mean, I mean, so I try to list some of the cons to it. I mean, obviously that's more work coding wise I mean, I don't know if I wouldn't say it's necessarily more than writing an operator, but it's definitely more than where we are now, which is no more code and you just do the thing. But that's part, right? Part of it. Part of the reason why we even had this as a high priority at the beginning is just the user experience today. There's a lot of things that are prone to error, right? People having to go edit YAML to then spit in a certificate name that they hopefully don't typo and specify the right path in is like, that right there is asking for challenges, you know? And then also trying to redeploy the entire Helm chart just for a certificate update is also where we're at today also. And that, or manually hacking the Kubernetes to like say I need the updated thing for this CSI secret store for the cert. Like it's like a really complicated thing for just a person that wants to not think about it, right? So we got to do something, and yeah, I don't know. So is there? I don't know. In terms of approach 3, is other things we want to talk about in terms of disadvantages or reasons why we wouldn't do that over the operator, or leave it as is? Or
I think the first bullet is most of it. It's just more, and it's just like with operator pattern, you know, we'd maintain a separate operator. Like you'd make a separate binary that would run as the operator. So all of the code that handles that is all separate. And if we wanted to have the same process that's fielding requests also be watching CRDs, then that code will mingle. And it just means like whenever someone runs CLI, we're just gonna have to not run that. You know, we'll have to be like, oh yeah, if CLI, don't do any of this fancy Kubernetes stuff, which that's fine. But yeah, just some of the things to consider. So we'll have to have Go routines that watch CRDs and do a bunch of locking to make sure that we're not, you know, stepping on things between threads. But yeah,
that's kind of the last bullet on the disadvantage of the mapping. You're like, okay, well, we have a config and we now have CRD. Which one do I do, right?
Yeah, so that you'd probably say, okay, I'm not going to watch the, like, if you're doing CRDs, you're not going to watch the config after. Like, you're going to load the config once, and then once it's loaded, you can change it via CRD, but you'll never reload some file or something. So yeah, there's more stuff to look at there, but it definitely will yield the best user experience.
Yeah.
And each cloud would have to write their own.
Yeah. So
Right.
like all of the stuff that's handled via CSI driver, like rotating, interacting with whatever store it is, would have to write that. We'd have to define interfaces for things, and people who wanted support for things would have to bring it.
I still think it's doable because the CSI driver is, at least the objects are pretty unified, right, across clouds.
Yeah, I mean, they do the same thing. They have the CSI driver is like an interface, and all the cloud providers just write, write providers that that talk to that stuff.
So the way that I envisioned also, let's just say we continue to go down the path of a notation verifier that has certificates listed. You have an option for which, like, with that notation verifier, like which store are you attaching to, right? So for Azure, you'd say Key Vault or whatever, or just call it Azure, I don't care. But and then you, that way you don't have to like create a whole nother CRD for like a notation GKE, right? Or you know what I mean? You could just do like one notation verifier, and then, you know, today it only supports, you know, Key Vault or Azure, right? And then if AWS or Google comes in and they want to add their own, they could just extend that notation verifier to include an integration with their, you know, secret store thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So is that the route we will be going? Like, are we saying we're going to implement this verifier plus certificate in the next few months?
I would
Like,
lean.
I would
lean that way.
I think so. I think it's a really good foundation to have. It's going to enable a really good user experience. It's going to like round out some of the rougher edges on the Helm chart deploy and the update of certificates and other scenarios. That's why I had it pretty high on the list, but open to feedback from others.
Yeah, the only other thing is it's the same thing that we have with Gatekeeper, or that when we were building our charts, is that if we CRDs aren't well supported via Helm. So like you can push them, but you don't control the order that things get applied in when you Helm install, Helm upgrade. So you know, as long as people aren't trying to glom Ratify and whatever else into one chart, then it will be fine. Because if you assume Ratify is already installed, then people can include CRDs in their own charts, and it's fine. It's just something to be aware of, that there can be
the general problem of you have to make sure the CRD is applied before you try and implement a specific implementation of CRD. So now I get that. Yeah, we would have to I could have sworn there's ways to handle at least a little bit of dependency factor there for our own chart. This has been an age-old thing. It's been around Kubernetes forever. So I've hard to believe that no one's figured this out yet. But I agree. Yeah, it's possible that somebody tries to install CRD for something that doesn't exist. But I mean, that's an error case that is whatever. You know, it's fine.
Yeah. So it's something on the con side, but I wouldn't say it's a battle-tested con at this point. Everybody who's playing this game has had to figure it out.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Cool.
So cool. I think, that makes sense. I think we could talk after the call and maybe priorities. And I know you mentioned Ben has had some code and other things, and so we can maybe talk offline on that. You had one more item, right, Susan, on the list for the call?
Before that, Akash, you've been extremely quiet. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, thank you. So,
well, I'm not as familiar with this area, so that's why I don't have as much to contribute. But one thing I can say is that in terms of prioritizing stuff, I will start to pick up more work for Ratify. So, you know, a bigger item, whether that's the CRD work for the verifier with the certificate stuff built in, maybe I could consider picking that up, but, you know, something to keep in mind going forward too. So, yep.
Cool. Awesome.
The next item we had is related to the certificates as well, because I saw Akash was mentioning like he's looking for an item to pick up. So David and I had a discussion like on this thread last week. So I just wanted to know, this support multiple notation through Ratify Helm charts. Is this talking about the secret mechanism or the key vault mechanism? Because for the key vault mechanism today, we support multiple certificate, but for the secret one, we just have the test chart, test cert.
Yeah, so I put this in, I believe, when we were talking about, people need to be able to bring their certs, and I think like we have hard coded like AKB cert 1, AKB cert 2, or something like that. And then we just have our one test cert. And so this was just, I'm pretty sure in Helm, you can specify things that get repeated for arrays. So this was just to explore having a good Helm experience where if you were going to provide an array of certificates via the Helm values, whether that needed to come from Key Vault or whether that needed to come from a file or you just pasting that into the values. Essentially just having a better way to handle people providing multiple certs via Helm. Although if based on our previous discussion, if we wanted to just let what we have be until we have the CR, like a way to put them in via CRD, then you could just probably ignore this and close it with that.
Sure. I can provide like the summary and then we can close this item.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Cool. And the last item, we have maybe 1 minute, is so I created a Ratify channel in the CNCF Slack workspace because I know previously Sajay suggested like OPA, but OPA doesn't allow members just to create channels. They had that disabled. So like the easiest thing for me to do was to create a public channel in the CNCF workspace. So I guess we can use that channel to communicate in the future for public messages. Does that sound okay?
Oh, that sounds awesome. I just didn't know that that was a possibility since technically we're not a CNCF project yet here. So
yeah, in the guideline, it just says, make sure you stay on topic. Like that's all they had. Like
okay.
if they have that enabled.
Okay. All right. Sure. Awesome. Yeah. Sounds great. Yeah. We can advertise that on our README homepage thing. Sure.
You can check with Amy. She's really helpful if you want to. And we can confirm before we push the button. Do you have the contact for Amy?
No, who's Amy?
All right. On the CNCF Slack, I can send you the contact.
Yeah, we should probably just double check before we at least advertise.
Yeah, sounds good. If it's a public channel, do you have to specifically add people, or is there a way to discover public channels and join?
No, yeah, you can discover. I actually just joined just now. Because I didn't know it existed, right? But yeah, you can just browse the CNCF and look at all the channels there. So people could technically find us just by being.
So David, you said you were able to find the Ratify channel.
Yeah, I found it and I joined just now. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll check with Amy then.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yep. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.